Bryce's blood type, Ronald knew, was compatible with Liam's, and Ronald would not have been able to save Liam anyway.
Dear listener, now playing the next audio series.
Getting your input was what you envision for your power going for your space.
Let's eat first.
Whatever you say. Boss?
Were you always this testy?
Always.
Neither could deny it. The chemistry between them.
And they wondered if she was from a rich family. They asked their children if they knew who her family was, but they lost interest when Valeria stepped onto the electric scooter. I thought her family was rich. Her father works in delivery services. Her dress must be a knockoff. If it weren't for that scooter, I would have mistaken her for a rich kid. Why would the kindergarten let the daughter of a delivery boy be in the same class as my child? I have to get them to switch her to a different class. Valeria hugged Stephen's leg. Daddy, they're making fun of you. Don't listen to them. Daddy doesn't care what they say. Valeria nodded seriously. You're much better than them. She tightened her arms around Stephen's waist. As he twisted the handle and sped down the street, he caught the last of the parents' gossip fading into the wind. Better than us? She must be joking. I have to tell my child to stay away from that girl in the future. She's a bad influence. When Stephen reached the residential area of their neighborhood, Valeria wanted to circle the block one more time. As they were walking back to the villa, they noticed a group of people in suits surrounding the gate. Valeria tugged on the hem of Stephen's shirt. Why are all those people in front of our house? She held her hand. I don't know, but I'll take care of it. The group noticed them as they approached and started whispering amongst themselves. Is that him? He's younger than I thought. He looks kind of ordinary. I was expecting someone more well-built. I've seen him before. That's him. He's the former commander-in-chief. Who are you? Stephen asked, walking up to them. Why are you loitering in front of my house? A man stepped forward and introduced himself. Mr. Adams, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a diplomat of the U.S. Please call me Preston. These are the members of my team. Stephen didn't know why they were here. After resigning from his position as the sovereign, he'd rarely paid attention to the country's affairs and spent all of his time on his family. Why are you looking for me? Preston gave him a rundown of the situation. Therefore, we hope you can lend us your assistance and give us your cultivation technique for the benefit of the country. Stephen ignored them and asked Valeria to head inside without him. Daddy, will you be okay by yourself? She asked hesitantly. Stephen crouched down and patted her head. It'll be fine, trust me. Okay, I'll wait for you at home. Valeria slung her backpack over her shoulders and went into the house. Preston's team members were impatient. Former commander, we're busy people. Isn't it time for you to hand over your technique? They were all here for the same mission, and they didn't want to stay for too long. Stephen didn't bother hiding his displeasure after Valeria went inside. You want me to give you my cultivation technique? My answer is a no, and there's no discussion. Preston and the team were taken aback. They hadn't expected Stephen to reject them. Their team had a high status, and even the highest-ranked diplomat, Preston, was present. Stephen wasn't the commander anymore, so they outranked him. Logically speaking, he should have agreed to their request without hesitation. Preston's expression darkened. He dropped all pretenses of formality. Stephen, this is an important issue that concerns our country. How dare you refuse? His team member added, Brent Robinson and his delegation team are being too aggressive during the negotiations. You're the former commander. Why can't you contribute? It's just a martial arts technique. It won't make a difference. Why can't you understand that? Stephen scoffed. To think you represent our country and the officials trust you enough to negotiate with Warhawk when you're this easily swayed. Don't you know how to hold your ground? His accusations angered the team. The bespectacled elderly team member gave him a stern warning. Stephen, I'll let that go because I respect you as the former commander, but don't take it too far. He's right, someone echoed. As the former commander, it's your duty to step up when the country is in a crisis. If you step back when we need you, you're unworthy of that title. Don't be a coward and tarnish the commander-in-chief position. Stephen leveled the team with a hard look. His aura swept over them. Those who'd been speaking righteously snapped their mouths shut, as if a hand had wrapped around their throats. What's the matter? Why'd you stop talking? Didn't you have more to say? Stephen spoke calmly, but disdain laced his tone. When no one answered, he went on. If you're done, then it's my turn. Let me ask you a question. Are you aware of our country's international position? We have the Sovereign and the Empyrean Circle on our side. We're not ranked first, but we're not that far behind Warhawk. By giving in to their demands, you've admitted defeat during the negotiations and put our country in a bad light. And now you're threatening a civilian. Do you think you're worthy of representing our country? The team was outraged. Stephen's aura didn't have any effect on them anymore. The elderly member glowered at him. Tyrell Fallon killed Adler Robinson. Our country is at fault. We agreed to their request for the sake of the country. Do you not understand the art of negotiation? Another team member said, Are you holding a grudge because your position was taken away from you? Is that why you're refusing to assist us? You should be ashamed of yourself. I've done what I could for the country in the past few years. I've made countless sacrifices. What right do you have to raise your voice in front of me? Stephen scanned the crowd. His intense gaze made them shrink back. There was no anger in his tone, but it sent a chill down their spines. Preston maintained his composure. We're at fault here. It's only right we make sacrifices. This is obviously a scheme. If you were the pillar of a country, would you lead an investigation team to find a culprit after murdering an influential figure from another country? Warhawk released that video, which was clearly targeting Tyrell. You shouldn't trust what you see. You need to think for yourselves and see beyond the surface. The real culprit is still out there, and it's likely someone from Warhawk. The team rushed to defend themselves. We know that, but we don't have the evidence to prove it. We have no choice but to stall for time. So what? Stephen asked. Are you going to force a civilian to make sacrifices for the country? Get lost and don't come here again. He turned around and went inside the house, slamming the door shut behind him. The team was dumbfounded. What should we do? One member asked in concern. We have no choice, Preston said. Let's go back and report to Mr. Sidney. We'll see what he has to say. The team returned to the hotel and found Sidney tidying up his appearance. You're back? I'm about to pay a visit to the former commander. Come with me. The team looked at each other. Sidney was a higher-up of the Leviathan unit, and he was their superior. The elderly member of their team had suggested visiting the former commander without Sidney to resolve the issue early and give him a good impression of them. They'd originally thought that they'd be enough to get Stephen to hand over his technique for the country's benefit. That way, they could pacify Warhawk's representatives and gain the Leviathan unit's approval. Their career would be smooth sailing after that. Stephen's refusal had thrown a wrench in their plans. That wasn't a big deal. With Sidney's status, he could easily make Stephen hand over the technique. Sidney noticed their odd expressions when he mentioned the former commander. He hoped they hadn't provoked him without him knowing. What's wrong? Preston recounted their meeting with Stephen, while his team filled in the details. Sidney's worst fears had come true. How dare you go behind my back and make a scene in front of Mr. Adams' house? Is this how you handle things? Preston and his team cowered from his anger. The elderly member's knees went weak. Sidney was worried that he wouldn't be able to accomplish his task today. Preston's team didn't know the Sovereign's true identity, but he did, and he knew that Stephen didn't tolerate that kind of behavior. He became angrier the more he thought about it. Come with me to Mr. Adams' house and apologize immediately. The team quickly followed Sydney out of the hotel. A member of the team lowered his voice and asked Preston, "Why is he so angry? Stephen's just the former commander." Before Preston could answer, the elderly member interrupted. "I don't think he cares about Stephen. He's just angry we did this without informing him first, and he thinks our way of handling the issue was inappropriate." Preston agreed. "We screwed up such a simple task. It's understandable that Mr. Sidney's upset. We have to do better the second time around." When Stephen returned home, he found his mother waiting for him in the living room. "Are you all right?" Victoria asked worriedly. "I'm fine. I asked the security guards to kick them out." Victoria was relieved to hear that. "Valeria's waiting for you in the bedroom. She was worried about you. You should go see her." "Okay." Stephen headed upstairs to the bedroom. Valeria was sitting on the floor, playing with a stuffed animal absent-mindedly. "Valeria, why are you sitting on the floor?" He picked her up and carried her in his arms. Valeria raised her head and stared at him. "Daddy, are those people here to cause trouble for you?" Stephen gave her a reassuring smile. "Yes, but there's nothing to be afraid of." Valeria nodded. "My daddy isn't afraid of anyone." "That's right. So let's not tell Mommy about this, okay?" She tilted her head in confusion. "Why not?" "Daddy doesn't want Mommy to worry." When Valeria heard that this was for Kim's sake, she didn't hesitate to agree to keep it a secret. Kim came home from work an hour later. Stephen, Valeria, and Victoria didn't say a word about the earlier incident as they gathered around the dining table for dinner. They were engrossed in conversation when the doorbell suddenly rang. Stephen got up. "I'll go see who it is. Eat without me." Kim put some more food on her plate. "Okay." Victoria remembered what had happened earlier that day and was about to say something when Stephen shook his head. He opened the door and went outside. The same group from earlier was back again. Stephen pointed to a park nearby. "Let's talk over there." He didn't wait for them to respond before walking away. Sydney swallowed his words and fell into step behind him. Preston's team didn't know why their superior was entertaining Stephen's demands, but they followed him anyway. When they reached the park, Stephen took a seat on a bench and glared at Preston's team. "I told you to get lost and never come back. Didn't you hear me?" Sydney quickly stepped in to mediate. "Mr. Adams, my subordinates were at fault. I brought them here to apologize." He whirled around and faced Preston's team with a stern expression. "Stop standing there in a daze. Kneel." Preston and his team were hesitant to get down on one knee in front of the former commander, but Sydney's intimidating gaze pressured them into doing as he demanded. Every member of the team kneeled and apologized. Sydney bent down and lowered his voice. "Mr. Adams, would you please overlook their behavior from earlier?" Preston's team couldn't hear their conversation, but they could guess what he was saying. Stephen didn't answer, so Sydney didn't continue and stepped back. Preston's team was beginning to realize the gravity of their mistake. Their superior was being unusually respectful to the former commander. There had to be something they didn't know. His entire team had treated Stephen like a joke. If he made a big deal out of it, they'd be finished. It was summer, and the days were getting hotter. It was cooler at night, but the temperature was still considerably high. The team didn't feel the heat. A chill had permeated the air. After a long silence, Stephen replied, "All right, I'll let this go for the Leviathan unit." Preston's team was relieved. Just as they were about to get up, he went on. "I'm sorry, but I can't give you my technique. Please leave." "Mr. Adams, please lend us your assistance," Sydney said hurriedly. "I've retired from all my positions. You don't have to address me so formally anymore. When I retired, I already told you that I wouldn't get involved in the country's affairs. The Leviathan unit promised that they would take care of everything." His words echoed through the deserted park. Sydney didn't know what to say. When Stephen resigned, the Leviathan unit had promised that they wouldn't disturb his retirement. But it had only been a year, and they were already coming to him for help because of the pressure from the overseas forces. They'd gone back on their promise. Mr. Adams, I'm not asking for your help with nothing in return, Sydney explained carefully. My boss said if you help us, we'll open the treasury and let you choose any martial arts technique you desire as compensation. Please think it over. Stephen gave Sydney a thoughtful look. The Leviathan unit was being exceptionally generous. The United States Treasury was top secret. No one knew where it was located except for the higher-ups of the Leviathan unit. It contained the country's treasures that had been passed down for thousands of years. The treasury's value was comparable to half of the country's wealth and 1/10 of the palace's wealth. Allowing a civilian to select a martial arts technique from the treasury was an unprecedented opportunity. However, Stephen's technique was priceless. It was more valuable than any martial arts technique in the world. The priest had taught him the technique and hadn't prohibited him from teaching anyone else, but it was only right for him to keep it a secret. When Stephen had paid a visit to the candidates selected to join the Armored Cavalry Battalion, he'd only taught them a superficial breathing technique. It was far from the core of the technique that the priest had taught him, but even that had greatly increased their strength. If Warhawk's representatives wanted this technique so badly, they must have found out his true identity. Demanding for the former commander to hand over his technique wouldn't be worth the effort, but it would be a different story if they knew he was the sovereign. Stephen looked up at Preston's team, who was still kneeling, and sighed. Get up. With his approval, Preston's team stood up one after another. Mr. Adams, are you agreeing? Sydney said expectantly. No, I'm not. My cultivation technique is unique. Even the most valuable martial arts in the treasury can't make up for it. On another note, has the Leviathan unit considered investigating certain suspicious points? For example, why would Warhawk's delegation team ask for my technique all of a sudden? Do you know the reason? A sense of shame washed over Sydney and Preston's team. Stephen's questions were valid. They had thought it was suspicious, but because of the time limit, they didn't have the luxury to conduct an investigation. Until you have your answers and a clear picture of the situation, continuing this discussion is pointless, Stephen said. If there's nothing else, please leave. As a higher-up of the Leviathan unit, Sydney knew that once Stephen had made his decision, no one would be able to change his mind. He respectfully said goodbye to Stephen and led Preston's team away. Stephen watched them leave before turning to head back to the villa. As he was walking out of the park, he spotted a woman hiding behind a tree in the distance. She noticed him looking in her direction and went up to him. Stephen smiled sheepishly. Kim, why are you here? Kim tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. You were gone for a while and the food was getting cold, so I came out to get you. Who were you talking to? Stephen didn't want her to worry, so he gave her a vague answer. No one in particular. We used to work together, and they came by to reminisce about the old days. You're lying. I saw what happened. They weren't here for a friendly chat. Stephen was at a loss when she called him out. He didn't know where to begin. Seeing that he wasn't saying anything, Kim continued. I recognize one of them. He's the highest-ranked diplomat in our country. I saw him on TV before. He should be busy with negotiations with Warhawk's representatives. He shouldn't have any time to spare, but he came to find you. She looked him in the eye. Stephen, tell me the truth. Are they here to make you take the blame? Stephen was stunned. He'd been bracing himself for questions about his identity, but he wasn't expecting this. When he still didn't respond, Kim was even more convinced that she was right. In the past, Stephen had been accused of treason and kicked out of the country. He managed to clear his name and returned safely. After that, Ron had forced him to take his son's place in the vanguard. In the end, Stephen was the only one who came back alive. He wasn't the commander anymore, but it seemed like he was in danger all the time. She'd been constantly worried about him whenever he was away for long periods of time. Some nights, she would lie awake in bed, wondering where he was and what he was doing. But she couldn't let her concerns show, because she had to stay strong for her daughter and her mother-in-law. After experiencing those incidents more than once, Kim had grown sensitive to these situations. She'd noticed Valeria and Victoria acting strangely at the dinner table, and she knew that something had happened. She'd questioned them after Stephen left the house. When she found out that a group of people had made a scene in front of their house earlier that day, she'd rushed outside, because she was worried that Stephen would leave with them. Tears welled up in Kim's eyes. "Stephen, don't take the blame, okay? I don't want you to leave." Stephen realized that she'd misunderstood and pulled her into a hug. "It's not what you think." Kim buried her face in his chest, not quite believing it. "Really? Really? I'm not lying." When Kim calmed down, she pulled back and looked up at him. "Tell me the truth. Why were they here?" "They wanted me to give them my martial arts technique," Stephen said honestly. "It would have been compensation for Warhawk's representatives. I heard it was their request. I didn't agree to it, though." Kim frowned. "Why are our country's officials like this?" "It's fine. I kicked them out. They won't be bothering us anymore." Stephen took her hand. "Let's go back. We've been gone for a while. Mom and Valeria are probably getting worried." At the hotel, Sydney sat on the couch with a contemplative look on his face. Preston's team stood off to the side, waiting for him to speak. When he didn't, Preston gathered his courage and asked, "Mr. Sydney, what do you make of this?" Sydney scowled. "You're still calling me that? Pretty soon we won't be superior and subordinate anymore. We're about to lose our jobs. The Leviathan unit gave me this task. They wanted me to ask Mr. Adams for his technique, but you went to his house without reporting to me and provoked him. Just where did you get the courage to act like you're above him?" Preston's team stared at the floor. They'd made a huge mistake. "Isn't Stephen just the former commander?" the elderly member asked. His voice was quiet, but everyone in the room heard his question clearly. Sydney was not pleased with his question. Stephen was the sovereign, and he stood shoulder to shoulder with the supreme leader. He possessed absolute authority, and he was the highest pillar of the country. Sydney wanted to tell Preston's team all this to make them understand just who they defended, but the sovereign's identity had to be kept confidential. "Mr. Adams is the former commander. That alone should be enough for you to understand. He served our country several times. He deserves unconditional respect. I'm a higher-up of the Leviathan unit, but even I treat him with respect. How dare you disrespect him behind my back?" Sydney's fury swept across the room. Preston's team didn't respond and kept their eyes on the floor. The elderly member shrank back in fear. Preston mustered up his courage again. "Mr. Sydney, please calm down. What should we do about this? Warhawk's delegation team is waiting for our reply." Sydney massaged his temple. Warhawk's representatives probably won't be leaving until they got what they wanted. This was turning into an even bigger headache than it was before. "Go back to your rooms. I'll report this to the Leviathan unit." Preston's team filed out of the room. When Sydney was alone, he dialed the Leviathan unit's private number and reported this to the leader. At the Leviathan unit's headquarters, the higher-ups were having another meeting. "Shouldn't Stephen know when to step up when he's needed?" Lance demanded. The higher-ups who had suggested having Stephen hand over the technique because it probably wasn't valuable were embarrassed by this turn of events. "This concerns our country's safety. There should be consequences for his actions." "Why don't we send him to the confinement room like we did back then?" another higher-up said. There was a pause. Then his suggestion was met with fierce backlash from the other higher-ups. "We can't do that. Have you forgotten what happened? Mr. Adams has done his best for the country. Confining him not appropriate. The leader gave the higher-up who'd made this ridiculous suggestion a cold look. Don't mention this again. Mr. Adams has done a lot for the country. It's us who let him down. Do you understand? The higher-ups quickly stood up and nodded. The leader's tension eased at his reaction. It's not strange for Mr. Adams to not want to give up his cultivation technique. We shouldn't make a big deal out of it. We should respect his decision and look for an alternative. We could give Warhawk's representatives a martial arts technique from the Treasury instead.
Dear listener, the upcoming episode will be today's last free episode of this story. Come back tomorrow to enjoy free episodes or get coins now to continue listening.
The higher-up who had suggested confining Stephen for refusing to hand over his techniques stood up again. Boss, we can't give up any martial arts techniques in the Treasury. They're priceless treasures. If they're replicated overseas, any martial artist could have the potential to reach the Grandmaster realm or higher. We won't stand a chance against Warhawk. The others in the room shared the same concerns. Seeing that most of them agreed with him, the higher-up continued. As we discussed before, a martial artist's potential is heavily dependent on their talent, and not necessarily on their martial arts. Given how skilled Mr. Adams is, he must be practicing a nameless technique. There's no harm in handing it over. And he won't be giving it up for free. He'll have the opportunity to select a new technique in the Treasury. Isn't this what we agreed on? That's correct, Lance said. But that's not a solution to our current situation. We need to figure out how to placate Warhawk's representatives. The higher-ups glanced at him. Let me finish. Because Mr. Adams is cultivating a nameless technique, it won't matter if we hand it over. All we need to do is forge a similar technique and give that to Warhawk. There's no need to reveal our treasury. The leader shook his head. I've already thought about that. But do you really think Warhawk's representatives are going to believe that Mr. Adams is cultivating a nameless technique? The higher-ups had nothing to say. He hadn't thought that far ahead. No one spoke, so the leader gave his instructions. Find someone to select a martial arts technique from the Treasury and inform Preston's team to make preparations for another negotiation. Dismissed. The higher-ups dispersed at his command.
Want to meet single women? Download.
Do you have what we asked for? Brent asked during the next round of negotiations. Preston's team didn't respond. Brent had expected this. It wouldn't be that easy to make the Sovereign give up his cultivation technique. He pretended he wasn't aware. Is it really that hard to fulfill such a simple condition? I apologize, but the former commander did not agree. The Leviathan unit has offered another cultivation technique as a replacement. Preston gestured to his team member, who got up and held out a box to Brent. It was made of gold and inlaid with gems. One could tell it was very valuable with one glance. If even the box was so precious, one could only imagine what was inside. Brent did not accept the box. He folded his arms across his chest. I told you before, what I want is the former commander's cultivation technique. I don't want a replacement. Preston motioned for his team member to return to his seat. He'd already predicted that today's negotiations wouldn't go smoothly. I apologize, but we are unable to fulfill your request. Please change your conditions. Brent propped his lights up on the table, not caring about his disrespectful behavior. Then please tell Tyrell Fallon or the Sovereign to come back with us to Warhawk. Preston was getting frustrated. Was Brent messing around? This was an even more impossible request. We won't be able to fulfill this condition either. Please make a different request. Brent sneered and stood up. You can't do this and you can't do that. It looks like you have no intention of negotiating. Then be prepared for conflict. He left the conference room with his subordinates. Preston's team were left in low spirits. We failed. What should we do now? A team member asked. Preston sighed. We have no choice but to report this to the Leviathan unit. What's the matter? Did the negotiations fall through? Preston's team hurriedly stood up and greeted the new arrival. Mr. Tyrell, what brings you here? gestured for everyone to relax. Tell me what happened. Maybe I can help you. Preston's team wasted no time and spilled their grievances. Someone pushed the blame onto Steven. This is all Steven's fault. He refused to give up his cultivation technique. That's why we're in this mess. When Tyrell frowned, everyone thought he was displeased with Steven, so they continued to shift the blame. Warhawk's representatives agreed to settle the issue, and the former commander gave them his technique. But Steven is prioritizing his personal feelings over the country and put us in a difficult position. He's jeopardizing the country's future. Mr. Tyrell, you have to teach him a lesson. The team thought that they'd finally found someone to back them up, so they vented their dissatisfaction and encouraged Tyrell to take action. Tyrell couldn't take their complaints anymore. That's enough, he shouted. He'd been in a bad mood since the recent turn of events, and hearing his respected teacher being mocked and ridiculed like this pushed him over the edge. The chattering members of the team immediately quieted down. Preston was delighted. It seemed like Tyrell was angry because Steven had refused to give up his technique. Mr. Tyrell, this concerns the country's safety. We would like to ask for your assistance. Please help us persuade the former commander to accept Warhawk's request. After a long silence, Tyrell sighed and said, "All right, I understand. I'll come with you if you want to talk to him again." Preston was thrilled. Tyrell was a member of the Empyrean Circle. With his presence, Steven wouldn't be able to refuse. If this worked out, he could gain Tyrell's favor and maybe even have a shot at joining the Leviathan unit. As for Tyrell, he once again was feeling guilty for going against Steven's wishes. We're in this predicament because of me. I'll only be accompanying you. The final decision will be up to the former commander. Preston walked up to him with a fawning look. I understand. When would you like to set off? The sooner the better, Tyrell said. I'll make arrangements right away. I'll be waiting at the security department. Call me when you're ready. With that, Tyrell left the conference room. The team gathered around Preston and complimented him. As expected of the highest-ranking diplomat in the country, you're the only one who could have gotten Mr. Tyrell to come with us. If he's around, Steven will have no other choice but to give up his technique. We'll be relying on you when we get there. The flattery made Preston more confident. Of course, it's no problem. I'll take care of everything. He had his subordinate book a flight to Washington, D.C., and soon they were on their way to Steven's house. At this time, Odin was in his hotel room. He turned on his communication device, and a man with a white horse mask appeared on the screen. How's it going? Not too well, Reeve replied. The target has a bodyguard around her. I've exchanged blows with him, but it won't be easy to take him down. I've had to retreat to prevent him from catching on to my identity. I don't think he knows about my affiliation with Vindictus. He most likely thinks I was there to assassinate his employer's family. Our plan is riding on your success, Odin said. You're not allowed to fail. I understand. I'll do my best to complete my mission. All right, please speed things up. Steven will be occupied for the next few hours. There's no telling when this opportunity will come again. Reeve nodded, and then the screen turned dark. Aren't you giving him too much pressure? Luther asked. It won't be easy for him to kidnap the Sovereign's family by himself. That's where you're wrong, Blaine said with a grin. Reeve's martial arts are similar to mine. There aren't too many people in the country who can match up to
Mulai dari
us.
yang ke-0
He's
ya.
holding back because he doesn't want to catch Steven's attention. He'll be busy for the next few hours, so it'll be the perfect chance for Reeve to make his move.
Terima kasih, hati-hati
When
di
Odin
jalan.
nodded in agreement, Luther apologized for questioning Reeve's abilities. Once Reeve succeeds, our revenge against the country will officially begin, Odin announced. His tone was neutral, but there were many underlying emotions. His subordinates were getting jittery at the thought of finally getting back to the country. They didn't bother hiding their hatred anymore. Odin ignored his excited subordinates and picked up the box on the table. He knew that pressuring Preston's team wouldn't be enough to make Steven give up his technique, so he's devised a plan to force him. While Odin's subordinates had been monitoring Tyrell's fiancée, Lana Chevalier, he'd instructed them to include the people around Steven. Most of the surveillance squads had failed because of an unidentified group's interference, but a few of them had completed their mission. Odin had sent Reeve and Gwen to take over the job so that they could act at any time. They held back to avoid alerting Steven and waited for the right opportunity to strike. The chance had come, and Odin was looking forward to his meeting with the Sovereign. Meanwhile, Tyrell and Preston's team had arrived in Washington, D.C. They were in a car heading to Steven's villa. Preston's team had offered to lead the way, but Tyrell rejected their good intentions and volunteered to drive. He was Steven's student. He knew this neighborhood better than anyone. This raised suspicions among the team. Mr. Tyrell, are you familiar with this neighborhood? When this question was voiced, the other team members spoke up. Yeah, I was wondering the same thing. Mr. Tyrell, you didn't need us to show you the way. Have you visited the district before? Do you know Steven personally? Everyone's eyes fell on Preston, as if he had the answers. Preston felt uneasy when their gazes bore into his back. He pretended to be calm. I don't believe he has. Mr. Tyrell is a member of the Fallon family, and they're currently stationed in the district. That must be why he's so familiar with this neighborhood. His explanation made everyone come to a sudden realization. So that's how it is. I was beginning to think the former commander had a connection with the Empyrean Circle. Tyrell glanced back, annoyed by the racket. Everyone in the back quieted down. No one made a sound. Tyrell turned around and focused on the road. He'd been worrying about what he would say once he saw Steven. He was a student, but he had no right to change his decision. He was overstepping his boundaries by accompanying Preston's team. Steven was the Sovereign, and the 10 members of the Empyrean Circle were his subordinates. He was the true leader of the aristocrats, and both his status and his influence were far more superior to the Imperial Circle. Tyrell was already on edge, and when he heard the team clamoring in the back seat, the noise had grated on his nerves, so he glared at them and put an end to their discussion.
Dear listener, now playing the next audio series. Episode 175, Facing Kaleidoscope. No need, said Emma. This is just a small matter. It's not worthy of your presence. How does Cheryl May think she's entitled to see Eric? She thought. Luke is enough. Eric was silent for a moment. Remaining on the call, he used the intercom to contact Luke. Hurry over to Brooklyn City Center and help Emma. Give her anything she needs. Emma had her phone on loudspeaker. Therefore, Eric's words resonated to every corner of the waiting room. Everyone was stunned, particularly the pale-faced Cheryl May, whose legs were trembling. Does this person have the power to ruin your life? Emma asked coldly as she put her phone away. Cheryl didn't respond. She felt all the energy seep out of her body. She gripped the edge of the table to prevent herself from falling. She'd never imagined that Emma would be acquainted with Eric Roberts. Who would have imagined that she has such a strong ally? She thought, stunned. She's even capable of getting Eric to offer his personal assistance. With Richard's explanation, the brand representative uncovered the entire story of what was happening backstage. He naturally had his own worries, and therefore, the most logical thing for him to do was replace Cheryl. However, although he'd already made this decision, he waited for Luke to arrive first to hear his opinion. During the half hour it took for Luke to arrive, Cheryl and her manager experienced the worst torment of their entire lives. Every second and every minute was like waiting for a life sentence. Cheryl wanted to find an opportunity to sneak away, but they were completely surrounded by people. She also wanted to contact Charlotte. However, her rival had just thrown Kaleidoscope in her face. Even if she were to contact Charlotte 100 times, it wouldn't change a thing. She stared down at the floor for a moment before grabbing Emma's arm and asking under her breath, "What can I do to make you let me go, Emma? Since we're both from the same company, can't you let me go just this once? I promise not to move against you again." Emma frowned down at the grip on her arm and shook it off. "It's too late. Can't you give people a chance to change? I really can't lose my modeling career." From the moment you decided to humiliate Lisa, you'd already given up your chance to even be considered human, let alone your chance of being a model. Emma took a step back as she spoke in a cold and scornful tone. "Cheryl, isn't an assistant worthy of respect? You also climbed your way up from the bottom. So do you think you're worthy of having someone else kneel before you? Since you made her bow down to you, you need to pay the price." The other reason why Emma was refusing to negotiate was because of Charlotte. Since she has so mercilessly crossed the line, if I continue to put up with her, wouldn't I be compromising my own values? At her words, Cheryl's hands began to shake. She felt a coldness sweep through her body. It was the first time that she'd experienced the feeling of true fear. "What will Mr. Roberts do to me?" Emma didn't respond. Meanwhile, everyone around them whispered amongst themselves. "Kaleidoscope has never gone easy when dealing with people," they muttered. "I know, right? If someone offends Kaleidoscope, it doesn't end well for them. She might as well announce her withdrawal from the industry." Do you remember the male star from before? Since he had such an inflated ego, he didn't listen to Kaleidoscope's instructions. Do you remember what happened to him in the end? In one night, he became yesterday's news, and now he's working as a cleaner. Cheryl's eyes widened in fear. Meanwhile, her manager, Ethan, was even more terrified. A wet patch gradually formed in the area where he was kneeling. He had lost control of his bladder. To onlookers, the scene appeared ridiculously funny. Approximately half an hour later, Luke hurried toward the backstage of Brooklyn City Center. The first thing he noticed was Lisa's swollen face. He quickly took her from Richard's arms. "Why are you hurt so badly? Who did this to you?" Hearing his anxious tone, Ethan's expression turned comically fearful. Meanwhile, Cheryl dropped to her knees on the floor. "How brave of them." Luke looked around the room. He was furious at the suffering and humiliation they'd caused Lisa. His voice was lower than usual and slightly trembling. After hearing everything that had happened, he directly asked Cheryl and her manager, "Did you know that Lisa is my fiancé?" The crowd was shocked. Fiancé, they thought. Emma's assistant is Luke's fiancé? Everyone's uncertainty was immediately cleared up. This explained why Emma was so familiar with Eric and why he had helped her. All their questions finally received answers. It's because Lisa is Luke's fiancé. This was something Emma had planned with Eric. She was going to pay Charlotte back, one debt at a time. But she wasn't planning on revealing her winning card just yet. As a result, they'd asked Luke to announce his relationship with Lisa, so Charlotte would realize that she had provoked the wrong person. Without waiting for Luke to discuss things with the brand manager, Cheryl quickly knelt on the ground and tugged at the bottom of Emma's dress. "Emma, I beg you, please put in a few good words for me. You can knock me down as much as you want, as long as you help me this time." "You're asking the wrong person," said Emma, hinting that the person she should be begging was Lisa. Cheryl let go of her dress and turned to Lisa, but Luke cut in. "Get lost. Get as far away from us as you can. He also declared that anyone who dared to work with Cheryl from then on would be opposing him. He didn't use Kaleidoscope's name. However, they all knew that Luke's words were equivalent to Eric's due to his command earlier about giving Emma everything she needed. In an instant, Cheryl's name had been banned from the industry. No one dared to challenge Kaleidoscope's authority, and she was immediately blacklisted. Contract cancellation calls began flooding in as word spread. Cheryl couldn't handle the blow and fainted. Everything happened in a mere 20 minutes. Who cares if she's a famous model, people thought. When facing Kaleidoscope, she still needs to bow down. She deserves it. The night's information was a lot to digest, but anyone with eyes could clearly see what was happening. Kaleidoscope never stuck their hands into another entertainment agency's business. However, Cheryl had failed to recognize who she was dealing with. Eric and Luke didn't even mention the company's name, but their identities were well known. How dare she bully Luke's fiancé? People thought. Does she really think she's so important in this industry? Scheming against others, humiliating others, knocking them down, and forcing them to kneel? She has a lot of nerve. Everything she did could not be denied. As for the news to be released the following day, people couldn't wait to see the result. However, there was another matter at hand: Emma's interview with Talkmaster. Her original motive for going on the show had changed. At that moment, she only had one aim, and that was to retrieve Lisa's grandfather. Later, she would make Charlotte bow down before her. Davis, once a ladies' man, now finds himself in the midst of a loveless marriage on their 5th anniversary. This isn't the anniversary I envisioned. It should have been about our love and not money. When his boss